my name is Anna, and I currently live in Scandinavia, but I'm originally from Russia. Um, and I was born there in the 80s and lived, I would say, half of my adult life there. Most of my childhood, we traveled a lot with my parents because my dad was a journalist, and I basically was not in Russia until my late teens. And then I graduated from there, from the university. I met my husband when I was around 19. We were married very young, and we've converted to Catholicism, both of us, around 2009, I think, if I remember it correctly. So before that, he was Orthodox Christian, and I did not belong to any denomination because my parents were very secular. My dad, I would say, was maybe culturally Orthodox Christian, but my mom actually comes from a family of Baptist Christians. She's from Belarus. So I became interested with Catholic Church initially because in Moscow, where I'm from, one of the major cathedrals also hosts a lot of concerts, like organ music concerts. So I started attending those. Then I started attending the Holy Mass, and this is how we basically ended up going there. And somewhere around 2010, I think, I met another girl who was attending the female center. She used to be a supernumerary. And we kind of connected because we both were pregnant at that time. She was pregnant with her first child, and I was pregnant with my second kid back then. So she was a very active Catholic blogger in Russia, and she shared a lot of testimony about her days in Opus Dei. And before that, I haven't heard much about Opus Dei. Like most of the people, I have probably watched Dan Brown's or read Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code and watched the movie. So that was my, I would say, impression about that and my main knowledge about that. But she kind of started to post a lot about Opus Dei, about the teachings, about her daily life. And so I was actually, I initially reached out to her asking whether she could take me to the center. So it's not like somebody was, trying to proselytize me or anything. I reached out myself just out of the interest and curiosity at first. So we started, I think I started going there once or maybe twice per month first. They had several language learning and language cafes back then. So how it works in Moscow, the female center is in a very, I would say, affluent central district in Moscow. And they live in they basically live in a very big apartment block, I would say, in an old housing, so the pre-revolution housing. And most of the women there, they are either from Southern America, Europe, and also, I would say mostly Southern America, France, Germany, and Spain. And so most of them work as foreign language teachers in Moscow or tutor other people in foreign languages. So they were initially offering a lot of language classes, and I started attending those because I was always interested in language learning. And then I started attending, they were also hosting a lot of like cooking classes, hospitality classes. I really wanted to improve as a housewife, as a mother. So I started to attend those. And then, like casually, they also asked me, of course, about my husband. I mean, I would say not them. The priest was generally interested in meeting my husband. So I arranged that meeting with my then husband. We're now divorced. So he also really liked the atmosphere in the male center. And interestingly enough, the male center in Moscow is much smaller than the female center. So they only, at least back then, I don't know, maybe they have moved somewhere else. But it was at the same metro station. And they only, the man only lived in a very big apartment there. So it's not like a huge apartment block like the women had. And overall, I would say the ratio back then, so in the female center, we had maybe around 12 to 15 numeraries, I think, together with the assistant numeraries, while in the male center, so they had three Opus Dei priests and around 5 or 6 numeraries, as far as I remember. So, and the majority, I would say, of numeraries in the male center were very young guys from Southern America or Italy, who were doing their bachelor's degree or master's degree in Russia. While in the female center, it was much more diverse, I would say, in terms of education and in terms of occupation. And interestingly enough, I think that the female center was also bringing much more money back then. So all the women had very nice jobs, very high-paying jobs, compared to the male center, where the majority of men were actually students. So I think back then they had only maybe 2 or 3 numeraries who were bringing in money for the men. And the disparity was very obvious because I soon learned that after joining that women were also collecting money and actually sending a lot of money to the male center because they couldn't afford to keep the apartment and to maintain the male center. So that was about the structure. So I whistled in 2011 together with my then husband. We did it simultaneously, and we were officially the first supernumerary couple that whistled in Russia. That was a huge deal for Opus Dei in Russia because before we joined, there weren't that many supernumeraries. There were a lot of expats from, for example, Argentina, Peru, and other countries who were working at Russia back then, like pre-war Russia. So they were attending, of course, Opus Dei, but there weren't that many local supernumeraries. Predominantly, I think, because Catholicism is not, of course, the dominant religion in Russia, and back then, Opus Dei, I think we're still struggling with that image, post-Dan Brown image. So they really struggled to actually get people in. And the main priests, I would say, so a little bit of side note, in Moscow, there were 3 main parishes, 3 main churches, and they are scattered all around like Moscow, so in various districts, and most of them are run by Jesuits. So we know about the the feud between Jose Maria Escriva and the Jesuits. So the priests in the main Catholic parishes were not very welcoming of Opus Dei, to say the least. But they managed to kind of occupy a small niche in one of the churches that is, interestingly enough, is located right across the main building of FSB, which is like former KGB in Moscow. So a couple of Opus Dei priests were having masses there because they had to do this. It was one of the, I think, of the major issues between Opus Dei and the local Catholic parish back then, that only I think one Opus Dei priest was giving masses in that parish regularly, while the other two of them were just basically secluded in the Opus Dei quarters and were only giving masses to Opus Dei members. So that was, I think, something very interesting and kind of, after reading a lot about Opus Dei in other countries where Catholic Church is dominant, I think that the structure in Russia was a little bit different, to say the least. So we've joined in 2011, and we were both supernumeraries until 2013. So we only spent there 2 years, and to be honest, it was more than enough to. I don't like to use the word like the verb traumatize, but to definitely turn me more into a road of becoming an atheist. To this day, I think if I hadn't joined Opus Dei, I probably would have still remained quite religious and Catholic. But after my experience there, I definitely started to accumulate a lot of doubt and a lot of grievances with Catholic Church, to the extent that I would say almost 2 years after we left Opus Dei, I stopped going to church and became an atheist altogether. So that was in terms of timeline. And let me think. So I think that one of the main reasons for me to join was that I really enjoyed attending their language courses and their language clubs. And of course, I really enjoyed the atmosphere. The women were very, very welcoming. When you come like from Russia and from, I would say, the nation that is deeply rooted into Orthodox Church, the contrast between Catholicism and Orthodox Church is very, very deep. So people are usually surprised when I tell them that in the reality of Russia and many post-Soviet countries, the Catholic Church is actually the progressive ones compared to Russian Orthodox Church and to even to some Protestant denominations that are present in Russia. So a lot of people, a lot of converts who join the Catholic Church usually leave Orthodox Church because of its harsh rules, its chauvinistic views towards women, and in general, very anti-LGBTQ plus views. Even though, of course, we all know the views in the Catholic Church compared to the Orthodox Church, they are very progressive and liberal in that reality. So I was looking back then for a more liberal church, I would say, and this is how I basically came into joining the Catholic Church. And compared once again to the atmosphere of the Orthodox Church, both Catholic Church and Opus Dei present this as a very welcoming and very friendly veneer. And I was just, I think, love bombed and felt very needed, very cherished and special, and just having all this nicely groomed and good looking, well educated women with higher education who act like they're genuinely interested in being friends with you, being your acquaintances, and getting to know you. That was very, I think it definitely stroked my ego back then. And I really felt special in a way that such wonderful women are taking interest in me, especially since some of them were younger, some of them were older. So that feeling of being loved and being cherished, that was something new for me, because both my parents and people surrounding me, I would say, were not as open, were not as friendly in the way people at Opus Dei were. And also having a lot of language practice, meeting a lot of foreigners, that also interested me from a more pragmatic, I guess, and practical side, just as an opportunity to practice my language skills, like both in English, French, and German. So that also played, I think, a huge role. Another thing I think that played a very big role is that I really strive to become a better housewife and mother for my kids. So I got really impressed by just the cleanliness, by the way the female center is organized, how everything runs so smoothly. And I really wanted to learn how to do that, how to become this well-structured, very organized and productive person. And I think that this is why Opus Dei became so popular in the US and in the Western world, because they do mimic a lot of productivity narrative and productivity culture that is very predominant right now, especially in the West and in the US. So I was really striving to become this better version of myself, a very productive member of both society and the Catholic Church, both at my work, because I was still working full time before I gave birth to my second kid. And also as a mother, as a wife, I really wanted to, this, I really had this complex of becoming the better version of myself in every possible sphere of life. And I thought that Opus Dei would help me in that. And things that they've told were very promising in that area, that might actually happen. I'm not gonna, I think, say anything about my ex-husband's intentions and why he joined. But I think it's probably because of the same promises and first impressions. I actually attended the male center. I was invited there together with my ex-husband, I think twice. They had us for a cup of coffee. And I knew every man in the male center, so it felt very inclusive back then. Of course, until we whistled. And so back then it all presented like very egalitarian in a way. The men in the male center were speaking very highly of the women, of the numeraries that were cooking and cleaning for them. And they also told us that, oh, we are also participating in cleaning and everything. It's not just them. So the first impression was very positive. So before joining, I visited both the female and male center to kind of get the impression why they're doing this separately and why they operate like that. And I think as many people complain or say why they have left after so many years, or not that many years, like in our case, is that, of course, before you join, you are only presented with the tip of the iceberg of all the information that Opus Dei wants you to know about their structure or about themselves. And so before we joined, I knew about like daily norms, I knew about some of the weekly norms, and about the way things operated, like that you were supposed to have a spiritual direction, that you were supposed to have two mentors, kind of mentor figures, one from the numeraries and one from the supernumeraries. So that was, I would say, the extent of information that we were given before we whistled. And then, of course, they also gave you a lot of books written by Jose Maria Escriva, like the way I don't actually remember how they translate in English, but the per, yeah, I now they were in Russian actually, so they translated all of his works in Russian, and those were ready available in most of the Catholic bookshops there. So I read those before joining. I nothing from the things that were written in his books kind of rubbed me in a wrong way, unfortunately. So I was quite impressed with his writing and agreed with a lot of stuff that he was saying in his books. So I honestly have not noticed any red flags before joining. And I would say the first maybe 6 or 7 months were quite happy. I would say we were, in a way, in a honeymoon stage with the organization back then. Partially, probably because we were also constantly, I don't like to use the word love bombed, but it is what it is, I think. There was another couple of supernumeraries at Opus Dei back then. They were both from Argentina. And we just immediately clicked, both my husband, my ex-husband and I, and this couple. And I think Opus Dei, like looking back and thinking about trying to remember how it happened, I think they also saw it that we immediately clicked and they tried to encourage this communication. So I would say they were probably the main reason why we decided to become supernumeraries, because their marriage and the way they operated was this huge testimony that, okay, marriage can be very fun, quite easy, and doesn't supposed to be a huge amount of work. They were an amazing couple, to be honest, like both as a husband, as a wife, and as parents. Back then, they had 3 kids, as far as I remember. Now, I think they have more than a dozen, as most of the Opus Dei families do. And they were very wealthy. The guy, he was a CEO of one of the major companies. I'm not gonna say which one, but a big food company, international company. So he was responsible for the Eastern European market back then. So I think just being constantly invited to their households, and they used to live in this kind of expat village in Moscow, very secluded, nice and wealthy village. So just being exposed to that kind of treatment, having people over every week, which is something that is not quite usual for Russia right now. And back then, people do not socialize that frequently in each other's apartment. And I always strived for that. I'm a people pleaser. So I always like to entertain people, to host people over, to have guests. So Opus Dei kind of provided this feeling of community, and that couple in particular, to the extent that when we had our second child, we still haven't whistled when I had my second kid, but they were ready to become godparents for my son. And they were very active in actually being godparents for our son up until we basically left. So there was I didn't feel like Opus Dei or anybody in the center were pushing us to whistle, but it was all done, I think, through this very soft and very covert nudges, like mentioning that, oh, you would be the first couple to whistle in Russia. We don't have any supernumerary couples, because back then they did have local supernumeraries, but they were mostly women, and they couldn't get like a married couple as supernumeraries. And back then, there were only one male local supernumerary, so they were not having any good numbers. And that was in Moscow. So what happened is that Opus Dei initially started in Moscow, and if I remember it correctly, so we joined in 2011, but Opus Dei, I think they opened their centers maybe 5 or maybe 4 years before that. So we were like the first wave of local supernumeraries and later numeraries. They didn't have Russian numeraries back then, I think now they definitely have, from what I've heard. But back then, there were no Russian numeraries. So all the numeraries and assistant numeraries from Eastern Europe who came to Russia were predominantly from Ukraine and Belarus. So back then, there were no centers in Ukraine and Belarus. I'm not sure. I think right now they do have a center in Belarus, if I'm not mistaken. But back then, there was only this center in Moscow. And so, kind of, all the members from Eastern Europe, all the numeraries, moved there to these centers. And the closest center, I think, was in Lithuania, because this is where we were supposed to go for the 1 week seminars for supernumeraries. So I never went for that seminar because it was very expensive. Like, we were supposed to pay for this 1 week seminar for supernumeraries from our own pocket. And because they could not arrange it simultaneously for supernumeraries, since we had kids, it was a very hard logistically to attend that, because we had to plan first for either me or my husband to attend it, and then for another person to attend. So, for example, I would go 1 year and he would go the next year. And of course, you had to pay for the trip and everything. I think they were providing accommodation, as far as I know, and food, but of course, you were expected to donate a lot of money. And back then, our financial situation kind of worsened a lot. So before we joined, my ex-husband had a very good job, and we were very well off, especially for people in our early 20s. We both had higher education, we both had well-paying jobs, so I think we looked very promising for Opus Dei. But unfortunately, a year into our membership, or us being supernumeraries, I was on maternity leave, and in Russia, you get paid for the maternity leave for maybe the first year and not the full salary. And after that, you stay in the maternity leave until your child is 3 years old, but you don't get paid. So we became a one-income household after a year, and my ex-husband also lost his job, so he had to find another job, which was not as good paying. Let's just say that. And he returned to academia part-time. So he started to pursue a master's degree. And that also affected, of course, our income. And I think I'll come to that maybe a little later on, because that was probably one of the reasons that affected our decision to leave, just the peer pressure from, like, the pressure from Opus Dei to earn more and make more money. So that's another topic, I think. So where did I stop? Yeah, so we joined together, and then we had this very wonderful relationship with the couple of supernumeraries from Argentina who became godparents for our child. And as I was saying, like, the first 6 or 7 months, I had some inklings that, it might not be as good as it's too good to, it's too good to be true. And of course, the first major signals were that they started to add on more rules. So of course, you have your set of daily norms, like the heroic minute, the morning offering, like having spiritual readings, attending daily mass, and so on. And then your weekly norms, and of course, yeah, so all this we knew before joining, but then of course they started to introduce the traditions, right? Like sprinkling holy water on your bed before going to sleep, and so on. And also giving you more materials to read outside of the traditional, like the basic couple of books that Jose Maria wrote. So I'm a very avid reader and I read very fast and a lot. So I started to ask them, okay, can you give me something else for the spiritual reading, because I finished reading most of Jose Maria's books quite fast, and I've reread them a couple of times, even like learning a couple of quotes, writing down some of the quotes that I liked, but I still wanted to read more. And this is how basically I think I ended up reading some of his memoirs. I think one was written by Don Alvaro, if I'm not mistaken. So they started lending me a lot of books written by his followers and by the first members of Opus Dei. There was definitely a book about women in Opus Dei that people lended to me, and they were all in English, so those were not translated to Russian back then. And this is when I started noticing a lot of, I would say, stuff that put me into a questioning mode. Let's just call it that. I don't know if you guys are familiar or if the viewers are familiar with the ex-Mormon podcasts or ex-Mormon YouTube channels. So before kind of learning about the ex Opus Dei community and before it started growing, because I think it started growing pretty recently, especially after that HBO miniseries. Before that, there was only like Odan, right, which was quite dormant back in the late tens, I would say. And this is it. So I did try to kind of look for alternative information about Opus Dei back then before I joined, because I always thought of myself as having this critical thinking. So I did look for materials, alternative materials critiquing Opus Dei, but to me, it looked like, oh, there is this really shady web page that probably was created in the early 1990s and hasn't been updated since then. And it looks like it's just 4 or 5 disgruntled ex-members who are complaining. So I quickly dismissed that. And us returning to the Mormon podcast. So this is where I kind of went after leaving Opus Dei, because to me it felt like the experience of ex-Mormons mirrored a lot of what I was feeling. And they describe it as putting it on the shelf. So every time you have a doubt, or if you question something about your faith or organization, you kind of put it on your shelf. And the shelf starts collecting the books or the items until it breaks. So I remember that when I started reading those books, those memoirs about Jose Maria Escriva, this was definitely the moment when I put the first item on my shelf of doubting, because it just read like he was not a nice person. Let's just say that.